Oh, I thought he did a fine job, and I don't want to take away from your sterling content. So,
Right. Okay.
I will say, though, that for those that are new to this discussion, this is a reprise of a session that Stephen and I did extensively pre-pandemic. So we're proud to pull this out of the closet, dust it off, update it, and share it with you today.
I promise to be a little bit controversial, just to be helpful. So my name's, yeah, exactly. So my name's Steve Walli, and I work for Microsoft. That's my day job, my night job. Thank you. Oh, you're counting. I thought you were telling me to take it down. Oh, speak into the mic. No. So I am also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins and Carnegie Mellon. That's a fancy way of saying I am a lowly paid instructor trying to figure out how to give learning experiences to students around software engineering in these kind of perfect labs that are well-run open source projects. So that's the night job. We thought that button worked. Maybe that button? Nope. That button. May I have the next slide, please, sir? And that's unhelpful. So back in 2007, I was giving a talk at a business school in Helsinki, and I put up this slide to kind of frame the debate because all of the mythology was landing. Everybody thought there was an open source business model, and I was trying to pull people out of this idea that, it's just software, people, and it's just communities, and it's just business. Unfortunately, the head of the department said, "So why are you here?" But there was still that idea. And can I have the next slide, please? So when I say it's just software, we've been collaborating on software since we've written software, because writing good software is hard work. And back in 1980, the US Congress put copyright law on software. And so we started getting inventive for almost 20 years in all of these different licenses, and then we finally ended up with the open source definition, which is a set of attributes on a license. It's all about copyright law. There's nothing fancy here. Open source in its purest definition is a set of attributes on a license for how we share to maximum effect. And it served us for, the slide used to say 25 years until Mr. Perrins corrected us the other day and said it's actually 26. Next slide. Oh, it's working now. Okay. Community. We've known how communities work since I had a campfire and you wanted to sit beside it, or the other way around. This is, as Jono said in one of his the opening keynote, this is a situation where we are as social animals. We build communities. That's what we do. But I also keep insisting, and I have to keep educating people time and time and time again, that there is no community except for the one you build. And so this is a really important thing that if you want to go out and do, as part of your business, something with an open source project, there is no magic community that's going to show up. You still have to build that community, and that's on you. So let's get to the business side of it. I'm an old fan of Drucker, and I love Drucker's simple idea that really the purpose of a business is to create and keep a customer. That's what the business is for. And there was this brilliant observation by Martin Mikos back when he was CEO at MySQL. And at the time, they were hockey sticking up into the right in all the appropriate ways that every business loves to be seen to be doing. And he made this fantastic observation for us at the Open Source Business Conference, for those of us old enough to remember it, that a community has time and no money, and customers have money and no time. This was when the penny dropped. This is when you actually had the sudden clarity of, right, that's what's going on. I keep wanting to call this Mikos' Law. I'm asking the whole room to continue to help me with that so that people honor that observation, because it is the critical observation.
Quick show of hands. How many know who Martin Mikos is in the audience?
Okay.
About half. Interesting.
Okay, so he was CEO of MySQL before Sun took them off the table for $1 billion. And that's why, it's a really interesting idea, because they were hockey sticking in the right direction, but we'll never know if they would have survived the onslaught of the the big data center because Sun took them off the table for $1 billion. And so we don't know if they would have survived.
How did that work out for Sun?
Yeah. They had other problems. But this is where, like, all of the do we have any VCs in the room? Okay, good. So this is so all the whining of the VCs that the open source definition needs to change is like, no, it's a business model design problem. The idea that you've parked an open source license on the software that enables your business proposition to a customer means you'd better be as crisp as MySQL under Mikos was if you're going to do business that way. Because if you aren't that crisp, you set up all kinds of tension in your business. Your sales team doesn't know how to sell, your marketing team doesn't know how to message, and your engineers are never sure if they're working upstream or downstream. So you need to be really, really crisp. I'm not saying it can't be done, but MySQL is the only company that a group of us could come up with that maybe could do it when that software project was the core value proposition. For the rest of them, they have business model design problems. To me, relicensing is not some critical problem. This is the controversial bit. This is just the industry self-correcting. And when I say the industry, I mean all of us in the broad, collective open source community and all of the companies that have an affinity for how open source is used in projects and products to engage customers. I have no problem with the Elasticsearch relicense because I went and ran the numbers. There was no developer community that was disenfranchised. 98.5% of that code base came from employees. The user community, the enormous user community, and Microsoft is a company that was part of that user community, both using source code and binary versions of it. Our experience got better in the relicense. And customer experience got better in the relicense. So, like, I look at Elasticsearch and Elastic Inc. relicensing. They did what they needed to do because their job is to hold a customer. So that's why, to me, all of this is there is no open source business model. There are lots of business models, but it's not about the open source. It's about how you think about the engagement with your customers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague.
Well, thank you very much. And how many of you now agree with Stephen? I want to see everyone raise their hands and say, yes, there's no open source business model. Come on, get those hands up. All right, 10 minutes from now, I'd like to see different results. So, is there an open source business model? Collaboratively developed, liberally licensed software enables community software development and evolving business models. Let's see. This segment, as Stephen touched on, is over 2 decades old. And it's really been amazing what this set of licenses has done. But it hasn't been the end of the story. And we're going to talk a little bit more about relicensing in just a little bit. But first, we're going to have a quiz. When was one of the first distributions of a enterprise-grade, open source, and you'll see that's in quotations, operating system, when did that get released and by who? And there's some hints here. Any takers, quickly? Share released its own operating system, what we would refer to today as a OS distribution, the Share operating system for IBM 709 hardware in 1959. So, can you name an early milestone in enterprise software, in the enterprise software industry? Was it when Bill Gates wrote that famous An Open Letter to Hobbyists email back in '76? How many know what I'm referring to in that famous email? Only about a third. So back, if you want to, these are now downloadable. The PDF is up on the conference website now. The link is there. But there's a very interesting historical observation that Gates made back when he was a young entrepreneur. And I'll edit what his statement was, but it was, gosh darn it, stop passing around free software or we'll never be able to make a living in this industry. But is that what I'm referring to? Maybe it's when IBM announced it would unbundle its software and hardware way back in June of 1969. And it wasn't because IBM was being altruistic. It's because back then, the federal government didn't think having a monopoly on the mainframe was a good thing. So IBM was actually forced to unbundle.
I would like to point out, IBM did not want to go through the Department of Justice meat grinder a second time.
Very true. But, this issue of, models, right? A dual licensing. Can anyone think of an example of a dual licensing in open source? They're out there. We're going to run over time. Bing, bing. Yep. Advertising partnerships. For a long time, Google supported our friends at Mozilla until they didn't. And Mozilla now with Firefox, I'm hoping they make a comeback. I'm encouraged because one of the Mozilla developers spoke at FOSDEM this past weekend, and Thunderbird is now coming up off life support. They're actually getting financial support again. And I'd love to see Firefox make a comeback. It's down to single-digit share. It's, the browser, which at one point was a key enabler of open web, is now tied up with Chrome and other folks. Support and service. Open Core is the one that I think everyone's really familiar with. That's been the one that many traditional tech companies have used. But these all sound like different business models to me, Stephen. Open source software delivered as a service. This is the real challenge that came into the forefront about 5 or 7 years ago as cloud started to really dominate growth in the tech industry. So can cloud kill open source business models? Building a viable business around real open source isn't easy. We haven't even talked about my friends at Red Hat yet, but we'll get there. Open source is winning in the data center as it's emerged as the standard for most cloud components, right? The interesting question is, to what extent do big cloud providers owe a debt to open source? And, how can that debt be sustained? And virtually, sometimes when I talk about, two things, I should have mentioned this up front. But when I talk about open source, I like to say I stand on the shoulders of giants, because go back 25 years when open source was really still new. IBM did a couple of, basically a triple crown of really smart things. Oops. So most people remember that it was in 2000, January, that IBM came out publicly and said, we're going to invest $1 billion in the Linux ecosystem, and we're going to enable Linux to run not just on x86 where it all started, but also on mid-range and mainframe systems. And not everyone remembers, though, that IBM helped write the bylaws for the Apache Foundation, because IBM was really supportive of wanting the early web to remain open. And then the other third of the Triple Crown was IBM was trying to solve its own problem with its enterprise portfolio. And at one point it found it had 4 different IDEs under development. And it didn't need 4, it needed one good one. But when it fixed that problem, it also then had to make another choice, because the Java ecosystem back then was very fragmented. And Microsoft was on the other side of the stage. I'll do my Steve Ballmer going, developers, developers, developers. And so IBM actually gave up about $30 million of software development to help form the Eclipse Foundation, and then had to jump back and throw its hands back and prove that it wasn't trying to pull a fast one, but it really wanted this to be an open part of the ecosystem. So I said I was going to get to this topic. So Microsoft surprised the industry and it acquired GitHub in June of 2018. How many remember that big milestone? Why is it doing that? I guess it's my... So I remember that day, actually, still, because it certainly, what was most amazing about that was that it isn't up here. How many remember what Microsoft paid for GitHub, approximately? Don't hear it out there. Say it louder. Oh, there we go. Hey, good eyesight. That announcement, when they made that announcement, Microsoft stock bounced enough to pay for that. So, pretty amazing. But it brings to mind the question that, if there isn't an open source business model, why did Microsoft pay all that money for GitHub?
Oh, I can answer that one.
We'll come back to that. We're going to get to the Q&A.
I might not now, but...
Keep heckling. Well, IBM surprised the industry, acquires Red Hat about a year later. And how many remember? Oh, there it is, $34 billion. That's just phenomenal. And Red Hat remains passionately independent. And they're going to remain that way. Yes. We just had a chat an hour ago about this. But yes. No, it's like, you need diversity in a healthy ecosystem. But again, kind of easy to argue that there's got to be some kind of business model here if someone's willing to pay that much money for an open source business. Now, I know someone will say that Red Hat is quoted as saying, we're not an open source company. We're an enterprise software company. But that's why it makes for an interesting debate. So, relicensing, sustainability, security. Is open source in crisis, or is this the new normal? So this is a teaser for my talk in Seattle in April. So cross your fingers for me. It's going to be an interesting discussion. But the bottom line is change is inevitable, but growth is optional. And the future of open source isn't a foregone conclusion. It's certainly not going to go away anywhere anytime soon, but there's a lot to be thoughtful about as we move into this next decade of open source. So, a quick show of hands. How many think, now everyone put your hand up so I don't feel bad. How many think there is an open source business model? Yeah, see, okay, it's split. If you haven't,
I'm feeling pretty good right now.
If you haven't figured it out yet, we're sort of arguing
I'm
two
still
sides of
feeling
the
really
same
good.
coin. With that, let's open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to ask, you showed us a bunch of numbers of big companies buying other open source companies, but then you didn't tell us the why you think they did that.
Yeah. Well said. I think that's
Great
a
question.
really good question. So the GitHub acquisition. Microsoft has, our entire history, Ballmer quote aside, is all about developers. And we've run a two-sided market platform for decades. That is our success. We need enough developers at the ISVs to attract customers and enough developers and customers to attract the ISVs. So we are all about developers, and that was an enormous developer community that we were reaching into to support. It was all about developers. Open source is nice, but that was about developers.
Well, quick show of hands. How many know what I'm talking about when I say Monkey Boy video? So when you go home tonight, Google Microsoft Monkey Boy video, because you'll see...
And I want to be very clear, I am not going to dance on this stage yelling developers,
Neither am I, but I'll give you an audio clip, because
Yeah.
this was from a conference that's got to be 20 plus years ago, when Microsoft was trying to prove how important developers were to them, and a somewhat heavy-set Steve Ballmer went out and started chanting,
Folks,
and
it's a hysterical meme.
He went on for like 5 minutes, driving the crowd of, I think it was a Microsoft employee event.
It might have been, yeah. So there was easily 20,000 people in the audience, and like it's a wonderful meme. You should find it.
But the other truth about this is that my humble opinion is that this isn't the most, or the real inflection point when Microsoft changed, because most people remember, Ballmer referred to open source at one point as a cancer on the industry, and that customers that were consuming open source had undeclared liability on their balance sheets. That's how much the younger Microsoft was against open source. But there was a point when the industry began to shift. And in about 2010, Ballmer publicly stated, when it comes to cloud, we're all in. And I knew at that point that Microsoft was going to have to change.
Oh, yeah, and that is the thing, is that when Nadella took over, he and Guthrie are on the record basically saying they realized Linux would have to be a first-party operating system in the cloud. And that was about 2011, 2012 timeframe. We were already contributing to the Linux kernel. At the time, we were also launching .NET Core was being open sourced, and not long behind that was VS Code, TypeScript, things like that. So the company was building that muscle long before the GitHub acquisition.
Well, and I basically kind of kidded Mr. Ballmer, but I have to say that he should get credit for Microsoft's pivot, because he began the pivot to open source. He just, because of his history, he couldn't really talk about it publicly because it.
Never be able to claim that.
Yeah, exactly. But Satya, question. Satya came out and publicly said, we love Linux. Why was that? Any quick responses? Azure, exactly. Because if you looked at the growth rate of cloud, public cloud, and then you looked at the growth rate of workloads on it, Windows was tracking nicely, but Linux was tracking even a bit more nicely.
Yeah, I mean, we joined the Linux Foundation 7-8 years ago on the board because already at that point in history, we were a Linux company. And that's where the Linux OEMs all congregate. So that's when we had to go join.
Any other questions? We've got about, here comes the microphone.
Uh-oh, the man from Red Hat has a question.
That's okay. No, actually, so I don't agree with the open source as a business model, and I kind of harp on that a lot. But
Thank you, Brian.
No, it's okay.
I'll pay you later.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that was a thing. But Jeffrey, actually, I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to get I want to feel like I give you some ammunition here, in all sincerity, in that when you've done this talk before, you talk about the success of open source and companies around it, like GitHub, Microsoft, Red Hat, yada, yada, yada. But you don't bring up open source, like business methodologies, like collaboration, because like at Red Hat, we have the open decision framework and a lot of, collaboration and not a lot of siloization. And I'm wondering if that's just too far afield of what you're trying to do or what? Yeah.
I'll pay you later, Brian. No, it's a great question, and I'll give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes IBM answer, right? How many remember when IBM created computers to play at chess, or at least heard about it? It was a big thing 2 decades plus ago, Deep Blue. About 11, 12 years ago, IBM repeated that experiment and created an application to play the best human players in a American quiz show called Jeopardy! Anyone remember that event? Pretty impressive proof of concept. Unfortunately, at that point, IBM was leaning back more towards patents and intellectual property. And I was trying to argue that that was an opportunity to reassert IBM's relationship with the open source community, because the Jeopardy! Proof of concept back then was created by IBM Research. What do researchers build proof of concepts on? Researchers use open source code. A lot of that was open source code. But Because IBM missed that opportunity, it had a chance to revisit it. And this gets back to your question. So about 5 years ago, we re-engaged with that team and said, doesn't seem like our strategy is working so well. Let's change it. And that resulted in IBM using the ability to collaborate with open source again in AI. We joined the Linux Foundation, LFAI and data. We made code contributions, and we started an inner source project because IBM found it had a fragmented stack across the business, over a dozen different natural language processing stacks. You don't need a dozen. You want one good one. And so that became an inner source project to consolidate that fragmentation. And to me, that's another proof point of how open source can be an important part of not just a distribution method, but a model for how to reinvent your business.
Sorry, Steve.
No, that was well answered, Jeff.
Thank you, kind sir.
Henry.
Thanks. I wanted to share what my takeaways are from your debate. So I start with Stephen talking about there are no open source business models, and it's a very catchy statement, and I'm drawn to agree with him. And Jeff, you listed the types of things that have been called open source business models, and yeah, I think they're all junk. Then I loved your point on GitHub, because it reminded me of how the US government's definition of open source is not the open source definition. It's just stuff that's on the internet that you can download. GitHub's business model is about public development. Its business model was built on public development, GitLab. It's a really big part of what they have. So I think there is a open source as such, a public development business model that happened. I'm not sure there are any still happening because I think they evolved. What I really liked is Brian's question, which I'm interpreting in my head as, are there any open business models?
Open business models. I like that. We might have to have a new debate.
Ooh, yay.
Yeah, again, coming back to the GitHub thing, public repositories, public being the important question, public-facing repositories were free. Unfortunately, they didn't force a license back in the day. Now, I don't know what the current statistics are, but for a while there, as we were acquiring GitHub, the statistics were horrifying as to how many unlicensed repos there were. And those are free. So while it was attracting, and this is, let's see if I can do this really quickly. 1990, we get Crossing the Chasm from Jeffrey Moore. And he talks about early adopting customers. And everybody loved the chasm metaphor. I have lost a company in the chasm before. I know what crossing the chasm, or what failing to cross the chasm looks like. But in that space, I think a lot of people around open source started thinking, oh, if I build a big enough community, then I have that. No, the early adopting community, go back to Mikos's law. The early adopting community, they aren't customers. They're not validating your business model to tell you that you've well designed your business model and you have something to grow on there. All you've got is a large group of users. And then you can get into the debate about, okay, can we convert them? And there is no conversion on people that don't have money. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't end up with some of those folks showing up later because they're familiar with your stuff. And now they have money as a customer. But it's not a clean conversion in a business model. So, yeah.
So I want to get an honest answer out of the audience. So can you face the corner for just a moment, please? So how many thought that Microsoft buying GitHub was a good idea? Raise your hand. Come on, let me look. Okay, look. Well, that's interesting. I didn't expect to see about half raise their hands. I didn't expect to see that many raise their hands. Anyone want to give me a shout out and answer why that was a good reason or a good thing to happen?
Stock price.
That's I touched on that earlier. You're paying attention.
I mean, it was a quick way in. I mean, it wasn't heavy lifted. It's like, boom, they kicked the door down.
A quick way into what?
Open source land.
No, we were already doing a better job in 3 of the biggest, most vigorous
But no one really knew that.
communities.
You're all wrong. You're all wrong. Oh, okay. You're all wrong. It was a good acquisition because now they have the single largest source of data around how open source developers actually work for years.
Ding, 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 ding,
Ooh,
ding,
I
ding,
like
ding,
that
ding, ding.
one.
But there's another reason, there's another less business savvy reason that it was a good acquisition. Most of the dialogue about GitHub back then was, when is it going to flame out? Because it had not made money over the course of its existence. And many, many developers and smart academics were going, man, what's going to happen when they can't keep the lights on anymore? And the other data point I'll share about that, great observation, thanks for sharing, is that the last evaluation I found when I looked for what you could, imagine that was worth was about $1.2 billion. So why did Microsoft pay $7 billion for something that even the most imaginative VCs thought was a 1.2 at the time?
Multipliers. That's just multipliers.
Oh, I think there was maybe another company at the table.
Hang on.
I want to join the Do You Remember When game. So, do you remember when there was this thing called SourceForge? So,
Yes.
Right. I'll also point out, controversial hot take, GitHub's not open source, right? It supports the open source ecosystem and community. But if we're talking about open source business models, Git is.
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, that's another interesting thing. Who knows who created Git? Only about half. It's amazing, though, but that was really, you could argue that Git is every bit as much, if not more impactful for Linus Torvalds than his work in Linux, because Git has changed the world from a software development perspective.
How much money he made?
I don't worry about Linus. He's paid quite well.
Yeah. Linus is well paid.
Okay, but 98% of the software industry is using its tool. I mean, he should have been a billionaire, right?
Did you ask him if he wanted to?
Does it matter?
Yes, absolutely.
About marketing sense. Who is going to create the next Git if we don't pay people who create something like this that entire software industry uses?
Maybe you should train his replacement. Maybe you should train his replacement.
Good point. All right, well, we're going to start running out of time. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't get the hook
No,
already. But
we've been given the hook high sign from the back of the
any
room.
final questions or comments before you give Stephen and I a round of applause?
Let's hear round 5.